This topic is quite a big one. Well, I suppose it would be because it's the internet, which is absolutely huge. So we need to be able to describe the internet as a worldwide collection of computer networks and give some examples of services that operate over the internet. The internet is the biggest WAN in the world. Now, I don't know if you can remember, but a WAN is a wide area network or a network of networks. So it only really makes sense that the internet is the biggest WAN in the whole entire world. And there's lots of services that operate over the internet. So they include email, sharing files, the World Wide Web, instant video and messaging. If you think about services such as Netflix and iPlayer, all of these are services that operate over the internet. Now, many people confuse the internet and the World Wide Web. Right, when you go onto a web browser, you are using the World Wide Web part of the internet. So the web and the internet are not quite the same. The web is just one of many services that operates over the internet. And something else that people say, which I know people do it all the time, but it's absolutely completely incorrect. They say that, oh, I haven't got any Wi-Fi, and they mean internet, right? And Wi-Fi and internet are not the same. Wi-Fi is just wireless technology that connects computers on the network. It doesn't necessarily mean that those computers are actually connected to the internet. But quite understandably, we do use Wi-Fi an awful lot as a means to connect to the internet. But just remember, Wi-Fi in itself is not the internet. So far, hopefully we've established that the internet is a worldwide collection of computers, networks, and we can give examples of services that operate over the internet, such as email, file sharing, the World Wide Web, instant messaging. We'll come back to this a little bit later on when we look at hosting services in the cloud. So thinking about the World Wide Web for a moment, we are going to look at something called DNS within the context of the World Wide Web. And that probably means absolutely nothing to you right now, but hopefully it will do very shortly. So what do we need to know? We need to know that what a URL is, and identify the domain name part of a URL. You might already know what a URL is, but if not, we'll do that very shortly. You need to know what an IP address is. You need to know the purpose of the domain name system, which is all incredibly important. Without it, the World Wide Web just would not work. And you need to know the basics of how DNS converts a URL into an IP address. So there's a lot of acronyms here today. And know that the DNS, domain name system, is made up of multiple domain name servers. This is quite a tricky topic to understand, so if you need to, you might need to rewind this, come back to it, just to go over it, just to make sure that you get everything that's in here. So, URLs. Let's have a look at URLs. So when you go onto a web browser, when you want to go on a website, you type in a website address. And you can see that a website address looks something like this in the address bar of your browser. So it might say https:// www.clickschool.co.uk/studio/. That's what a URL looks like. But there's different parts to a URL, and each part has a special meaning. So let's have a look at some of the parts. So the HTTPS at the beginning is known as the protocol. And you might already know that S means secure, so it means that any data that goes between you and the website is going to be encrypted. The www part is what's known as a subdomain. Again, you don't really need to know that at this stage. What's important is this next part, the domain name. So hopefully you can see here it says clickschool.co.uk. That is the domain part of a URL. Not sure if I mentioned, but the URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. So going back to the domain, so it says clickschool.co.uk. The .co part is what we call the top level domain, and the .uk is a secondary level domain. Now, of course, some websites like facebook.com, google.com, etc., they've just got a top level domain part, but that's absolutely fine. Then after that, sometimes you'll see a list of what we call folders, or you can call them directories. In this case, we've just got index.php, which is a file name. So hopefully from this description of a URL, you can identify the domain name part. So in this case, it's clickschool.co.uk. Now there are other parts to a URL as well, but we're not going to go into that much detail. So why am I telling you all of this? Why are we looking at the domain name part of a URL? Well, computers can't use the domain name to find a website, right? When you type in ClickSchool or Google, whatever it might be, that's all good and well for human beings to remember and type in. But to a computer, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Every server on the internet, you might remember looking at servers before, has what's called an IP address. And the only way of getting access to that server is to know its IP address. So we use something called DNS, domain name system, sometimes called domain name service. We use this to translate the domain name into an IP address. Now an IP address looks something like what I've got here, 77.72.1.2. It's a bunch of numbers. So that's really difficult for humans to remember, but for a computer it's absolutely perfect because it can use that number to figure out where that server is exactly on the internet. So there's a system called DNS, domain name system. So if we don't know what the IP address is for, say, clickschool.co.uk, what we do is we send that domain name off to the domain name system. And you can think of it as like a massive directory, right? Something like Yellow Pages, if you could remember what Yellow Pages is. You might not do, or a phone directory before they all went electronic. So what the domain name system does is it looks at the domain name and then it tells you what the IP address is for that website. So I've got a diagram here which explains it fairly simply. So at the top it says what happens when google.com is entered into a web browser. Well, first of all, your computer will check to see if it already knows what the IP address is. If it does, hey presto, we can contact Google directly. But if we don't know what it is, so it might be the first time that you've ever visited that website, although I imagine you visited it hundreds of times, if not thousands before, but just imagine it was the first time that you visited it, that's a long word. What we would do is we would send it off to the domain name system. The domain name system would reply with the IP address, and then we can use that to access Google's website. That's the simple version. Now, if you think about it, the domain name system has got to use lots and lots and lots of servers. I mean, why do you think it is? Why do you think that there's not just one DNS server on the whole entire internet? Hopefully you're thinking that, hang on a minute, there's millions of websites, people go on lots of these websites all the time, and if there was just one server, there would be too many people trying to access it and it would be really, really slow. So it makes sense for the domain name system to use multiple servers. And to add to this a little bit, although this is probably beyond the scope of the course, there's something called a DNS hierarchy. Now you might remember earlier on that we looked at clickschool.co.uk. So what the domain name system will do first of all is it would go to the root server within the DNS system. And it would ask the root, hey, do you know what the IP address is for clickschool.co.uk? The root would reply saying, sorry, I don't, but I do know the IP address of the server that knows about .co domain names. So then we go to the .co DNS server and we say to the .co DNS server, this sounds like a bad joke, doesn't it? We go to the .co server, hey, can you tell us the IP address for clickschool.co.uk? And the .co server comes back and says, nope, sorry, I don't, but I do know the IP address of the server that knows about .co.uk domain names. So then we go to that server and we say, hey, do you know the IP address for clickschool.co.uk? And it replies, no, it doesn't. Actually, what that will tell us is the IP address of a name server that knows the IP address for clickschool.co.uk. So then we go to the name server and say, hey, do you know the IP address for clickschool.co.uk? Hopefully it will say, yes, I do. And then it will send that IP address back to us, and then we can access clickschool.co.uk. Hurrah! Whew. Now, all this back and forth between servers, this is done by something called a resolver. So actually, when you want the IP address of clickschool.co.uk, what you do is that request will go to, in all likelihood, it will go to your ISP, your internet service provider. Your internet service provider will have something called a resolver, or a DNS resolver. And that is the server that goes back and forth between the root and then the .co and then the .co.uk server and then the name server, etc. That's the part of the DNS that finds out the IP address for you. Now, if all of this sounds rather confusing, which I imagine it does, then don't worry, because in likelihood, all you really need to know is the simple version, which is if your computer doesn't know what the IP address is, it asks the domain name system what it is, the domain name system replies with what it is, and then you can contact the server that you need to go on. Now, if you do go onto my website, you'll find more of a detailed diagram that explains that in more detail. And that might be worth going over if this is something that you are interested in. So DNS in itself actually stands for domain name system. So sometimes people say a domain name server, meaning a server that operates within the domain name system. So it's a little bit confusing, all these S's, system, server, service, etc. So it might be worthwhile just writing down a definition that DNS stands for domain name system, or occasionally you might see it written down as domain name service. I said this was a big topic today. Well, that's DNS, which operates on the World Wide Web. So hopefully you know what a URL is or looks like. We've described that. It's like https://www.clickschool.co.uk, and from that we can identify the domain name part, which is clickschool.co.uk. You know what an IP address looks like, for example 77.72.1.2, and you also know what the purpose is of the DNS, right? We need the DNS because domain names are friendly for humans, but they're not for computers, which is why we need to convert them into an IP address, and that's done by using the DNS. All right, so be sure to understand that is quite a tricky topic. Now, fortunately, the rest of this topic is pretty straightforward. So next, we are looking at hosting. Have you heard of the word hosting before? What do you think of when you think of the word hosting? Right, so we need to know what that is. We need to know what the cloud is. So we all mentioned about the cloud. What do we actually mean by it? And I'm not talking about those white fluffy things in the sky. We need to know that servers in the cloud can provide many different hosting services, and we need to know the advantages and disadvantages of the cloud. So what do we mean by hosting? So hosting is a service provided by server software, such as hosting a website, a web app, file storage, email. So hosting servers let users access data via a network. Now there's lots of organizations that will do this for us. So Crystal is a company that I use to host my website. So they've got a bunch of servers in the cloud, and I can use those to host a website. But as we previously mentioned about the internet, there's other hosting services. So it could be email, right? It could be web apps, so running something like WhatsApp. File access like OneDrive or Dropbox, Google Drive, etc. And of course, when you think about it, there's all sorts of hosting that goes on. So there's servers that host videos, if you think about iPlayer and Netflix. There's services that operate booking systems, so we can book plane tickets or hotels or concerts. There's servers that allow us to play multiplayer network games. Right? There's servers that allow people to share medical information online all over the place. There's special services that do that. And in fact, if you were to head over to Amazon Web Services, their website, you'll see that there's all sorts of specialist kind of hosting services that they offer. Now, you don't need to know all of these. You just need to be aware that there is different hosting services that are available. So what does the cloud actually look like? Right, so I've got a picture here that shows parts of a warehouse, and it's got all these servers that are stacked up on top of each other, a bit like ring binder folders, just stacked up on top of each other, going from floor to ceiling. Right, and all of these are the computers that operate within the cloud. And these are incredibly impressive locations. You might just be able to see at the top of the picture there's a huge amount of cabling that goes along the top there. So there's different cables that go to each of the computers. So these computers that operate in the cloud, there's no end of them. And these cloud services can be incredibly expensive to set up. But of course, companies that specialize in it will take away all of the headaches for us. If I wanted to host my website myself from where I live, I could do that. But I'd much rather pay someone else, because then it's up to them to maintain the server for me. But of course, I've got to be able to trust them with my data. So really, I'm just going on to the benefits and drawbacks. So of course, the benefits of using the cloud is that all of the hardware is maintained by the cloud provider. Right, so I don't have to worry about patching the server or making sure if it's up to date or not. So I don't have to worry about that day to day. That I pay for someone else to do that for me. So that's done by the cloud provider. It's likely that all of the data is automatically backed up, but it does depend on who your provider is. If you've got data that's accessible in the cloud, then it's possible that that can be shared between different people and different devices. So that data then is accessible from anywhere with an internet connection. And if you think about it, this cloud technology, it just results in having so many different business opportunities. So if you think about driverless cars or Google Maps or any kind of website that's been developed, that is all thanks to this cloud technology. All these computers that are there for us in the cloud, operating these services. So it's pretty cool, really. But of course, there are a few drawbacks. So an internet connection would be required to access any service that operates in the cloud. So if you think about some internet-only retailers, I don't know, like ASOS, for example, right? If you want to buy clothing from them, well, you have to have an internet connection. And if you don't have an internet connection, then you can't benefit from it. A lot of banks up and down the country, they are closing their branches, so people can't just walk into a branch. They have to have an internet connection to be able to access it. And if they don't, then they just can't benefit from these services. And of course, there is a cost involved. So I pay a certain amount every year for this company to host my website for me. I mean, yes, you can get so much storage space for free. If you think about OneDrive or Google Drive, yes, you do get some free storage space, but beyond that, there is a cost. Okay, these companies aren't going to provide all these services for nothing. They've got their families to feed and the technology to pay for, and so on. Now, of course, a lot of this technology relies on good security systems being in place. So if someone manages to hack your password, they could potentially access all of your data. And of course, you're relying on whoever it is that provides your cloud services to look after your data. You need to trust that they aren't actually secretly stealing it and ciphering and selling that off somewhere. And of course, you're trusting them to make sure that their hosting service is completely secure and completely robust, and that they've got some resilience in the network somewhere, so that if one of their data warehouses happened to burn down, which hopefully it wouldn't, but if that happened, then you're relying on them to have a backup somewhere else that can just seamlessly continue working. There's lots of videos that explain the cloud in a lot more detail, so if you've got time, head on over to YouTube and take a look. So just a quick recap on this. So hosting is about servers on the internet running a service. And the cloud is simply a bunch of computers in a warehouse somewhere that are connected to the internet. You need to know that these servers provide services such as hosting websites, storing email, running web apps. And hopefully now you're thinking a little bit more about the advantages and disadvantages of cloud technology. So we're almost there. We're just going to look briefly into 3 different areas of cloud technology. So cloud storage first of all. So cloud storage is where all of our documents can be saved onto one of these computers in the cloud. So I've got an image here of my computer, and there's 2 drives here. I've got OneDrive and there's a Google Drive file stream. So they enable me to save files directly to a computer in the cloud, which I can then access from anywhere with an internet connection. So cloud storage is really, really good, assuming you've got a fast internet connection, which leads us on to the benefits and drawbacks. Obviously you need a fast internet connection, because without that it would just take forever to save a file and to load a file. But the benefit being is that you can access your files from anywhere that has an internet connection. You can rely on your cloud provider to back up all your data for you. You can share files between different users, so then you might be able to work on them collaboratively and get the job done, whatever it is that you're doing, really, really quickly. So it might be that you're writing a newspaper or some article for a magazine, and it can be the case that lots of people can work on that at the same time. So it helps you to be super productive. With a lot of cloud storage, it's possible to make sure that any time you do save a file, that it's automatically saved onto the cloud. So then all of your files and settings are automatically synchronized across different devices. So at the moment I'm using a desktop computer, but I know if I go into my laptop, when I turn it on, it will automatically refer to files that are within my cloud storage area. So I'm always automatically accessing the latest version of my files. But of course there are a few drawbacks. So although you get so much storage space for free, you do have to pay for more storage space if you need it. And this is particularly true for businesses. Obviously you need an internet connection, and the speed of that connection can't always be guaranteed. So if you have a slow internet connection, it's going to be really frustrating if you can't access your files. If someone hacks your password, then they could potentially access all of your files. And you have to trust that your cloud provider is actually keeping the data secure and not misusing it or passing it on in any particular way. So what about cost? So I did a little quick comparison. I went on the internet and I thought, right, how much would it cost to buy a 2 terabyte hard disk drive? Now that's a huge amount of storage, and I'll be very surprised if you would actually need that amount of storage at the moment, unless you're doing some really technical, lots of technical work. Anyway, that would cost you about £48, and that would be a one-off payment for the life of that disk drive, which could be 10 years or more, I suppose. But if you wanted the equivalent in cloud storage space, at time of writing, I saw that it would cost me £95.88 per year. So that's quite a difference, but you've got to keep in mind the benefits that cloud storage offers, and you've got to ask yourself, well, is it worth paying that little bit extra? So it's worth keeping in mind that although you do get so much storage space for free, if you're a business and you're paying someone for cloud services, for cloud storage, you are going to have to pay them some money. So it is not all necessarily free. You've got to remember that someone has to pay for it at the end of the day. So can you describe what's meant by cloud storage? And can you think about some of the benefits and drawbacks to using cloud storage? Okay, 2 more, almost there. Cloud software applications. So cloud applications are those that run from an internet server. and the apps are typically accessed using a web browser. So you probably used something like Google Docs or Office 365 or even something like Pixlr, which is a photo editing app, and all these run inside a web browser, which is pretty cool. Now, of course, I've got some photo editing programs on my desktop computer, but they're only going to work on my desktop computer. They're not going to work on any computer that's on the internet. So a clear benefit of using cloud applications is that generally they will run on any computer that has an internet connection. I don't need to worry about installing any software. And if you think about a big network, like a school network, right, you don't then have to have technicians going around every single computer installing software, because it all operates in the cloud, in the web browser, and you're always going to automatically have access to the latest version. So there's no software that you need other than a web browser. And very often, although lots of these web apps are free to use, even with the premium ones, you can just pay for what it is that you want to use at any one time. So, for example, Adobe have got a monthly subscription model where you can just pay for the software in the months that you use it. And of course, anything that's on the cloud can be shared. So you can share files between different users, which can be good if you're all working on the same project together. But of course, there are a few drawbacks. You need to make sure you've got an up-to-date web browser, although really in this day and age that's not an issue. Sometimes web apps don't contain as many features as desktop software. Because they're working in a web browser, sometimes they're not quite so powerful. Although as technology is progressing, it's quite amazing what some of these web apps can actually do. And of course, with these cloud apps, very often you have to pay a subscription fee. So with the desktop programs that I use that I've just installed on my computer, I've just paid a one-off fee to be able to use those. But with cloud apps, very often you have to pay a monthly subscription fee, and in the long term that can work out as being quite expensive. So, can you describe cloud applications? And can you think about the benefits and drawbacks of using them? Okay, last one. Almost there. I said it would be a long video today. A description of cloud processing. So this is something else that the cloud's very good at doing. Processing huge amounts of data. So if you think back to that description of the cloud being a warehouse full of hundreds, if not thousands of computers, that is a huge amount of processing power. And we can use that to perform various calculations. And there's far more processing power in one of these warehouses than there is in just a standard cheap desktop computer. So you might be using a cheap desktop computer, but from there you can access this huge amount of processing power by making use of lots of computers that are in the cloud. So what are these cloud computers used to process? Well, it might be that they're used to look at weather data and use that weather data to help predict what the weather would be like in the future, or to monitor changes to the Earth's climate. Or they might be used to process billions of images that could be used for some kind of machine learning project, perhaps a project that helps computers to drive a car. Now, likewise, there are benefits and drawbacks of cloud processing, and this is similar to the benefits and drawbacks we've already looked at. So, of course, the benefit is that you can have access to a huge amount of processing power. So you can process lots of data incredibly quickly. And that could really help a business. So it could help with determining how much fertilizer to put on a field, or the best time to harvest a crop, for example, for farmers. Or it could be used to analyse data to try and look for cures for various illnesses. And of course, you don't need a powerful computer yourself. You can just rent the processing power when you need it from a cloud service provider. And although this sounds a bit dystopian, you could use it to catch a criminal. So there's talk of using CCTV cameras to analyse pictures of people as they walk by. And if there's a known suspect, someone that you want to talk to, you could theoretically process all those CCTV images to help find whoever it is that you're looking for. And of course, you've got to ask yourself whether that's an invasion of privacy or not. So in terms of drawbacks, yes, you have to trust the cloud service provider not to misuse any data that might be on there. You have to trust them not to lose your data. And you just need to be careful about privacy, thinking about all that data that might be in the cloud and what would happen if some kind of hacker got access to it. So security is often a very big issue when it comes to cloud service providers. So we've now looked at some topics concerning the internet, and hopefully that was informative, and I hope you've enjoyed this today. Bye for now.